well, let's get into chapter 16 here. So, like I said, a lot of this is going to feel like review, which is fine because covered a lot already. So we're kind of coming back to this idea of absolute and relative surplus value. Again, just kind of a reminder of what that means at the top here is absolute surplus value is basically the surplus value you get from extending the length of the working day beyond the necessary labor time, right? To that the worker has to work in order to like sort of reproduce themselves, right? So if it takes a worker on average like 4 hours a day to sort of pay for their own existence, so to speak, or do enough labor, um, social labor to sort of afford their own existence and probably the existence of their family as well. Um, then any additional time you work beyond 4 hours would be surplus labor. Um, Now, whether that surplus labor gets appropriated by the community, the worker, or a capitalist, or a slave master, or a lord, or whatever, will obviously depend on your mode of production and relations to production, all that good stuff. In other words, we can still have surplus labor, even in like a socialist context, except the surplus would not be privatized or like privately appropriated, collectively appropriated, kind of go to a social surplus, which we would use for whatever.
Basically, like community funds.
Yeah, it'd be a big old honking community fund of products mostly. And that can be stuff like, for example, you're probably going to want to have to stockpile essential goods. So, be medicines, food. Um, I mean, like look at COVID recently. You had an almost instantaneous shortage of respirators. I think, right?
It was respirators and N95 masks, like
and masks,
immediately.
Yeah, it was like an instantaneous shortage because, again, in capitalist production, you're not appropriating the surplus for any sort of social good or social need. You're doing it exclusively so you can make more profit. And if there's not enough demand for like N95 masks at any given time, there's no point in producing like a huge surplus. Obviously, there are still crises of overproduction. And I think with masks, that kind of did happen because you basically had this like sudden massive spike in demand, right? Where everyone and their mother needs masks like right now, basically. And there are a bunch of companies all jumped on mass production pretty much overnight and essentially like massively overproduced to meet the demand in a short amount of time.
Yeah, so, I was at.
Yeah, good.
A quick anecdotal. I was at Home Depot doing overnight shelving when the short stock of that stopped. Ended up getting like 33 freaking boxes of them on one night because it was all set to the freaking that name of the supply chain setup where it's as needed production.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Just in time production.
That one, thank you. And when you have been backlogged for an extended period of time and you are set up to order based off of that, it tends to send most of these systems just staggering amounts of more than you could ever willingly use within their functional lifetime. It's just kind of a the fuck sort of moment.
Right.
Yep. That's the thing that always tripped me out from dealing with those sorts of like algorithmic like doing the orders on the little like tablet thing when I worked at a 7-Eleven was always like it was always wrong. and then we were always getting yelled at to like go more by the books of the tablet. And then the more that we would use the algorithm, the more fucked up the fucking sales predictions would get.
Yeah, it basically required a full-on freaking audit to fix the problem. And that's full-on inventory audit to just go through and repunch in the numbers of everything. It's like, what the...
Well, yes, because
Apologies.
it only works if, for one, every single input variable is accurate, meaning nobody scanned the wrong product, things weren't like stolen and or unaccounted for having been lost or damaged. Like there's a whole bunch of like different variables that impact the effectiveness of these algorithms, and unless every human element is working at like machine efficiency, then the whole thing breaks down.
All right, so that's absolute surplus value. I know I rapidly got off track. It's okay. Just quickly on relative, what that means, right? Relative is just comparing how much surplus labor time there is versus necessary labor time. So even if you don't extend the length of the working day, if you're somehow able to either usually you'd be reducing the amount of necessary labor time so that the remaining time you're working is suddenly now surplus. And that we talked about that a lot, chapter 15, because that is what productivity usually will get you. So you make a lot more products in shorter amount of time because your technology is getting better, for example. That means the amount of time you need to work to sort of pay for yourself or reproduce yourself is suddenly much, much less. So the rest of your working day, or a much, much higher percentage of your working day, is now all surplus. You're working for free, basically. So yeah, that is the two definitions. But to jump ahead here, so I'm going to start right here. So there's this interesting idea that I think Marx has already introduced a bit, but the idea of like productive labor, specifically being the production of surplus value, especially in capitalist production. We're not really, we're not or if you're a capitalist, especially, you're not concerned with the necessary labor. You know, that is usually not the very much. You want to make sure your workers are working way more than that, because all that surplus value, surplus labor, is not being paid for. Therefore, it's just direct gain, right? That's why it's called a surplus. So he goes on to say the worker produces not for himself, but for capital. It is no longer sufficient, therefore, for him simply to produce. He must produce surplus value. The only worker who is productive is one who produces surplus value for the capitalist. In other words, contributes him towards the self-valorization of capital. If we take an example from the outside of the sphere of material production, a schoolmaster is a productive worker when, in addition to belaboring the heads of his pupils, he works himself into the ground to enrich the owner of the school. That the latter has laid out his capital in a teaching factory instead of a sausage factory makes no difference to the relation, the capital relation that is. The concept of a productive worker therefore implies not merely a relation between the activity of work and its useful effect between the worker and the product, but also a specifically social relation of production, a relation with a historical origin which stamps the worker as capital's direct means of valorization. To be a productive worker is therefore not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. So I think we do hear this slung around, especially in like reactionary propaganda, right? Is this idea of like, if you're not being productive, and keep in mind what they mean by that. They mean this. They mean you aren't serving capital. and that's bad. That makes you a bad person. This is basically
Yeah, this is
neoliberalism, like incarnate.
This is basically where the whole like grind set comes from, right?
Yeah, I think the grind
So
set
if you're not
is
like
literally just this
monetizing your free time,
internalized.
you've failed capital.
Yeah.
It's also, since I've spent time on social media, I don't know how many comrades here actually spend time on social media, but that I'm not like dissing them for that. I'm just saying. But it's the whole grind set is also man they don't bring up how you are alienated from your labor. In fact, they make it seem as if all the work that you're doing is for yourself and nobody else. These people are already very anti-Marxist, and they firmly believe that surplus value does not exist.
They've they've basically run into the whole individualized horse malarkey.
Yeah. They say that you work for yourself and you grind for yourself. There's nothing about what you're producing or the value you create with your labor. They only see it that it's just a one thing that you do work and somebody just gives you money for it just because they feel like it. That you just have to grind for money. And typically this comes from people like like on the recent level of the D program, how Hassan said that, liberals don't start from level 0, they start from like negative 30. This sentiment of like your labor being individual, it almost feels like a child's view of the world. It stems from extreme low levels of non-existent class consciousness, an almost infantile view of the world. And typically the people that sell this grind set idea are also selling something else. Because
Oh yeah, the grift is perpetual.
There's typically a product that goes along with this.
Right.
yes. And
I'll even highlight this sentence. Shit. Try and change colors. So I'll hit this again. Shut up. Stupid thing. Alright. The worker produces not for himself, but for capital. That's what they're trying to sell you, right? Is that you're working for yourself. If you grind it out all day, every day, work overtime, all this good stuff.
You can be your own boss.
Yeah, be your own boss. What do they call it? Like financial independence, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, you might collect a higher wage at the end of the year at the expense of having no fucking life, by the way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're serving capital in way, way higher proportion than your fellow workers who aren't doing that. So, yeah, it's 100% propaganda, right? Because it's this sentence, but inverted. It's basically telling you, oh, you're not working for the capitalist. You're working for yourself. It's bullshit.
And speaking about... Oh, you go.
I was gonna say, worse than that, they're trying to sell you on the fact that you can become the capitalist, which I mean, maybe,
absolutely can't.
But no. But you were also mentioning how like this is very childish way of looking at things, as far as the perspective that would lead you to thinking the grind set is a good idea. But you hit the nail on the head, absolutely, because most Americans, and I would actually extend that to most of the kind of imperial core Western world, English speaking world for sure, is that you're not really taught critical thinking. You're not really taught, dialectics or the types of things that would give you the necessary tools, the grown-up tools even, to really critically look at claims like this and to really like understand, or even not even necessarily understand, like you don't even necessarily have to have like life experience context. You just have to have the ability to kind of look through and look at something and see the sort of, the different moving parts at play just within an isolated system to basically be able to assess on your own fairly simply that it's bullshit. But the capitalist system thrives on people not having those critical thinking skills and not giving them to them. Speaking of things that I felt like I've almost had to take by force in my life, is basically building up those cognitive tools to see what essentially Marx is laying out here in, half a paragraph.
That whole don't expect an entrenched state to give you the tools or education needed to replace it.
Exactly right.
The master's tools will never destroy the master's house.
Mm. Well, they should, but that's more wish fulfillment than anything functional.
Idealism.
hmm External inputs required.
Just through my notes really quick. So we have a couple pages here of sort of, again, it feels a lot like a review because we're kind of reviewing how capital sort of invaded and took over all like the domestic industries and handicrafts. So again, the kind of like a super fast version of chapter 15 in some ways. I guess to summarize it, right, it continues to act as a special method of producing relative surplus value in two respects. Insofar as it seizes upon industries previously only formally subordinate to capital, that is, insofar as it continues to proselytize, and second, insofar as industries already taken over continue to be revolutionized by changes in the methods of production. And we're pretty familiar with how capital does these types of things. It spreads, and then once it's in an industry, it sort of it starts working its logic, increasing productivity, increasing intensity, all that fun stuff. So at the bottom of this page, I'll skip ahead a little bit here. Again, this paragraph mostly is kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning, just reviewing relative and absolute surplus value. So we have this is an interesting point. I think I've brought up before, but I kind of wanted to highlight it again because it also leads into this paragraph. So this has to do with sort of the distinction between capital and capitalism and other previous modes of production. So for yeah, you'll see what I mean. But basically, the idea is that if a worker must use all their time to produce the necessary means of subsistence for himself and his family, he has no time left in which to perform unpaid labor for other people. Pretty obvious, right? So
Yeah.
this is kind of what I meant in the beginning with if for some reason it took you 12 hours a day every single day to basically feed, clothe, and shelter yourself and your family potentially, yeah, you've just literally cannot spare any other time to work for other people, especially if it's unpaid. That'd be crazy. And we would expect that to be more common and at like a much lower level of development. And even then, I think most of the evidence suggests that. Well, actually, I think he might say. Well, okay. He might get to it later, but you can't have anything like capitalists, slave owners, barons, whatever. Basically, none of this class distinction even matters if nobody has time to like produce a surplus. This is mostly hypothetical, I think, because even like super ancient societies, there was at least some surplus, but usually that surplus would only be used to feed like people who are unable to work. Think of like children, obviously, maybe the elderly, so on and so forth. But like really big surpluses that sort of make slavery, feudalism, and capitalism possible. That takes a bit of time to get to. And like I said, I don't remember where he says this. It's in here somewhere. But the other reason people in the past didn't actually work that much is because their standard of living was like comparatively lower compared to what we have now, or at least what they were producing was like pretty straightforward. It was almost all agriculture or gathering or hunting. And then maybe you had like some pretty straightforward handicrafts, some maybe like basic masonry going on, some maybe basic metalworking, basic weaving, kind of again simple handcrafts. Like nothing was too intensive, and nobody had like it wasn't like a super complicated technology going on. Pretty much everything was directly appropriated from just the environment around you. You didn't have to work it that much to make it functional. I mean, in my head, I'm almost thinking like if anyone's familiar with that Primitive Technology channel, that dude
Oh,
in
yeah,
Australia is
yeah.
just like making stuff out of mud and sticks. It's like,
Great
yeah,
channel. I got his book.
it's a sick channel, and you get at least like an idea
Of what it takes to
of
make these original primitive
Yeah.
designs.
and to be fair, I mean he's only one dude out there grinding by himself, so he puts a lot of hours in, I'm sure. But now imagine there's like 10 or 20 of the same dude doing the same projects. Each one of them doesn't really need to do a ton. They could probably work a few hours a day and just like knock out a whole village of mud huts like pretty quickly. So yeah, like even back in the day, basically because it was a much lower level of development, people didn't actually like work 12 hours a day. In fact, I'm pretty sure like most of the anthropological evidence suggests that's like a very new phenomenon that is pretty much exclusively found in like the capitalist era. People working just like insane hours. It's a very modern phenomenon because yeah, that all that surplus labor, all that surplus time is not benefiting the worker or society at large. Benefiting a ridiculously small minority benefits from that.
Has the capitalist class been richer than ever before? Like, was the capitalist
The
class
wealth
during
disparities that we are seeing now have, to my knowledge, literally not existed outside of borderline mythical figures.
Yeah, because I was wondering if say the clothing manufacturers, the mining companies, these agricultural companies during Marx's time that were extracting capital from, say India, Australia, or even within the imperial core, was there what could their wealth even be close? Were they just as rich as they were today, or has due to capitalism reaching its final stages, has um the wealth accumulation from surplus value reached almost
So
mythical
I
levels?
think I think if you
I-
measure everything in like contemporary monetary ways, right? So if you compare how much like someone's net wealth in dollars versus the rest of humanity, um, I think what I've heard is like, oh, we're like reaching kind of robber baron levels of inequality. But I would say that just measuring it in terms of money, like dollar amounts, is not a very good reflection of how bad it is right now. Because think about what the uber rich have in terms of like material wealth. They've got
Take a
fucking
look
like
at
rocket ships
yeah,
nowadays. Like,
And
literally
things
rockets
What-
and like satellites.
Gates is
Yeah,
massive
one thing I was going to say
accumulation
too
of
is that
farmland.
one thing I was going to say is that wealth and net worth don't come in the form of simply just liquid money. They come in the form of mainly assets. I know billionaires do a lot of, like, the ruling class get into a lot of investing as well, but a lot of their wealth is concentrated in their physical assets like real estate, factories, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think today's wealthy, it's like not really even comparable to the wealthy, let's say 100 years ago. Even if by like, if you just do the percentage or sort of ratios, you might say, oh, the ratio is pretty similar. But you also consider like the really, really poor in 100 years ago were like significantly poorer than they would be today. And that just kind of is a reflection of just, again, just general increasing productivity across the board. Right? Our technology nowadays is significantly better, but at the same time more materially intensive. 100 years ago, I don't think anyone cared about like rare earth metals, but consider how much how much effort and just labor basically goes into extracting rare earth metals all over the planet. Although it's obviously more concentrated in places like China and South America. But yeah, I think that because of our technology level being so much higher these days, that means we need a lot more resources, and we need to do like so much more extraction. Way more extraction nowadays to afford what the wealthy have compared to 100 years ago.
We've discussed previously, and because it was discussed, I forget exactly where, further back in Capital, about how that forward change of the sort of quality of life has an impact on what can be considered like the living wage or the minimum wage or whatever, like that minimum amount required for a worker to reproduce his labor and reproduce himself. But to answer to kind of go back to the original question though, it absolutely, there are different ways to measure inequality that would get you different results, where you could definitely point to,
The standard of living
thousands
in Zimbabwe has increased by 47%, but we've
Right,
also increased the amount of human suffering there by 3,000%.
yeah. I mean, there's like a number of ways to look at it. You can look at it in like ratios of dollar amount, the inequalities and the increasing gap between like CEO pay and employee pay is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, qualitative gaps in standards of living between the richest person in a country and the poorest person. Another way you can look at it is just, the sheer concentration of wealth, how many people possess what percentage of the world's total wealth, whether that's dollar wealth, property wealth, I mean, whatever you want to measure that by. And by that measurement, I'm almost positive that global wealth has never been concentrated in fewer hands. I mean, and that's, you have to kind of take into account that there is also a lot more global wealth now than there was 100 years ago, 500 years ago. I mean, even, when perhaps global wealth was concentrated in the hands of, maybe a couple hundred, couple of thousand members of like the nobility and landed classes and things like that prior to the rise of capitalism. But I think as far as within the history of the system we have now, there are absolutely measures that you could look at that would unequivocally state that yes, the wealth gap between the richest people and the poorest people has never been larger, but there are also almost certainly measures where you could point to the raising of the lowest standard of living and say, well, even the poorest person today is wealthier than the poorest person 100 years ago, which I believe somebody mentioned.
Actually, there are some great absolute garbage arguments specifically from Fox regarding that, where they go through a list of very basic utility items like a microwave, a refrigerator, an oven.
We've talked about that before as well, and it's like, and that argument is to a degree garbage, because you can't look at a current situation relative to the situation of like the same kind of person in the past. You have to look at their situation relative to really
the time
the
frame
average
it's
today.
in.
Right. Otherwise, you're comparing apples and oranges, and it's a spurious argument. So yeah, long, unsatisfying answer to a question that should have a far simpler answer than that.
Would this also relate to a fairly common but also stupid argument that it's supposed to be a counter argument to the arguments we make against capitalism, which is I forgot the exact quote statistic they had put up, but it was supposed to say something along the lines of, since the 1800s, poverty had gone from like the world poverty rate was like 80% or something like that, and since then it's gone down to like, I forgot the exact figures, but that's one of the common arguments they use when attempting to say that capitalism is actually an effective system.
But again, the problem with that, and I think what you're getting at is, well, their definition of poverty apparently hasn't changed in 100 years either.
Actually, it's even dumber than that.
Like, if the capitalists are the ones who get to define poverty, then they can just give themselves a gold medal.
You mean poverty?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Akeem just made a video on
I heard
this
you
too.
say property.
Oh,
Yeah,
I didn't
that's also
mean
what
to.
I heard.
Well, poverty then. Anyways, yeah. So, yeah, that's basically the answer. Because like even if you look at, I think later in this chapter he mentions like, ancient Egypt as well. Even if you do the math and be like, okay, let's assume the pharaoh of ancient Egypt owns everything in the entire country. Just the entire ancient Egypt's productive capacity is belongs to the pharaoh. Let's just say that's the case. It's like ancient Egypt did not have like close to the productive capacity of, I don't know, I can't even pick a company. The ones that come to mind immediately don't actually make anything; they just sell shit. But you guess modern GM, sure, yeah. Well, yeah. That's
the first thing that came to mind that makes something and that's large.
Exactly, yeah. GM. And I was also gonna say, actually, the comparison I was thinking of for a second there was like, if you said, "Hey, Pharaoh, do you want everything in your entire country, or this like super yacht that's like 300 feet long, just an absolutely titanic boat?" Like the labor time contained in that boat is probably more than the entire country of Egypt like 3,000 years ago. If we're adding it all up, right? Like the value of that yacht is
like,
astronomical.
If you're adding it, yeah, I was gonna say, if you're adding up the labor time historically across like the entire supply chain, as well as the like development chain of each of those supplies, then yeah, I could see that.
I would wager. I know it like it's just a thought experiment. Basically, there's no way to actually measure that, but I think it sort of passes the sniff check that, yeah, I'm pretty sure one billionaire's like super yacht is probably more than most ancient kingdoms, you know, in terms of just labor time. So yeah, I would say, yeah, today's billionaires are like insanely, like disgustingly wealthy compared to any other time in human history. All right. Speaking of more history stuff, so he wants to kind of connect surplus value to a natural basis. So again, we're getting back into some good old fashioned materialism stuff here. So he says, like, just so there's no real obstacle preventing one person from lifting himself from the burden of labor and imposing it on another, just as there's technically no natural barrier from preventing you from eating the flesh of somebody else. Kind of again, this like vampirism analogy, I guess, or cannibalism analogy. And it says we'd be mistaken to attach any mystical notions to the spontaneously developed productivity of labor, as is sometimes done. It is only when men have worked their way out of their initial animal condition, and therefore their labor has been to some extent socialized, that a situation arises in which the surplus labor of one person becomes a condition of existence for another. At the dawn of civilization, the productive powers acquired by labor are small, but so too are the needs which develop with and upon the means of their satisfaction. Okay, that's what I was thinking of. That's the quote. So basically, back in the day, your productive powers were much lower, but you also didn't really need as much. So ultimately, you didn't actually need to work all that much. He says, furthermore, at that early period, the portion of society that lives on the labor of others is infinitely small compared to the mass of direct producers. I don't know about infinitely, but yeah, this is basically this is like your children and very elderly are the two segments of your population that really aren't doing any productive labor, right? Kids are just doing kid stuff, playing around, whatever. And really, really old people are just vibing and being elders, basically. They're not really going out in the fields or collecting, farming, or anything like that. Let's see. As the social productivity of labor advances, this small portion of society increases both absolutely and relatively. Besides, the capital relation arises out of an economic soil that is the product of a long process of development. The existing productivity of labor, from which it proceeds as its basis, is a gift of not of nature, but of a history embracing thousands of centuries. So, yeah, basically, capitalism takes a long time to get going because we got to make sure the material conditions are right to actually enable something like that. So yeah, interesting paragraph. It kind of ties a lot of this back to the historical materialism, which is pretty nice. Nice to see. Here's what else. I won't go through this too much, but yeah, that's the ancient Egyptian part. All right, let's see here. Next part I want to look at is oh wait. Yeah, okay. Right here. So again, more interesting, I guess you'd call it historical materialism as well. It's kind of a bit of the theme of this chapter, which is kind of interesting. So we have this question of where is capital most likely to pop out of the social fabric? Like, if we had to basically guess on the planet, where would capital as a social relation begin? He essentially suggests that it's probably either more northern climes, more temperate climes. So let's see. He says, where nature is too prodigal with her gifts, she keeps him in hand like a child in leading strings. Man's own development is not in that case a nature-imposed necessity. The mother country of capital is not in the tropical region with its luxuriant vegetation, but in the temperate zone. It is not the absolute fertility of the soil, but its degree of differentiation, the variety of its natural products, which forms the natural basis of the social division of labor, and which, by changes in the natural surroundings, spurs man on to the multiplications of his needs, his capacities, and instruments and modes of his labor. It is the necessity of bringing a natural force under the control of society, of economizing on its energy, of appropriating or subduing it on a large scale by the work of the human hand that plays the most decisive role in the history of industry. So it's an interesting suggestion from Marx that basically, if you're in the tropics and you've got like pretty readily available food supply, you have a varied food, like not just food, but like you basically have a high amount of biodiversity. It's sort of how I'm like putting some modern interpretation of what Marx is saying here. A lot of biodiversity, basically a lot of easily accessible resources, and also just warmer climates means we don't really need like intense buildings. Basically, life is a little bit easier in the tropics. Basically, I think is what he's suggesting here, and you don't need to tame a lot of natural forces, and basically like do that. So, and I think it's an interesting suggestion because on one hand, I get what he's saying, that there might not be this like imperative to do that, but you also have like situations like I'm thinking of, what's it called? It's like the Islamic Golden Age, right? Where you had like this period in like basically what is ancient Iraq, essentially, where I'm kind of imagining this picture of like life's pretty great. We have like a ton of food. We don't really need to expand our industry that much. Life's pretty good already. So like, let's just do a bunch of science and math and like cool stuff. So I do think, I wouldn't say that, the lack of abundant food sources and an easy life means that people won't innovate or won't do any sort of industrialization or math or science or any of that. I still think it can happen, and I think there's historical examples in which it has happened. Like that's kind of the idea of like a golden age, right? In history, is like things are great right now, so you've got a flourishing of arts, culture, math, science, all the good stuff. And usually those are in times of basically what I think of as like surplus. So I think what his suggestion is basically when that isn't the case, in maybe more northern climes where maybe life's a bit harder, you aren't sort of handed everything, you are almost forced by necessity to become very creative and also, I guess, work the land like more intensively to get what you need. I don't know. It's an interesting observation. I'm actually kind of curious what everyone else thinks of that.
I took a human geography course my first year of college, and we learned the same thing in that course, which I thought was weird at the time. But so I have heard this other places before as well, not just from Marx.
I also took a human geography course. Maybe I think it was high school though, but I don't know. I remember almost nothing from it at this point. But I mean, yeah, it's one of those where, like, I guess I'm sure there's plenty of research on this stuff that I just don't know about. It does sound roughly correct. Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty reasonable, I guess. So let's skip ahead some more. We'll do a little bit of Mark's dunking hours. Why not? So he's going to dunk on John Stuart Mill a little bit here. Mill says,
Damn, he was spitting.
Did we just lose Grade A?
maybe for a second.
I think so, yeah.
believe we did.
Am I back now?
God damn it.
You are back. You are back.
Left us on a cliffhanger with that one.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what happened there. Just a little internet blip.
Bit of a
No,
hiccup.
you can't. No, you can't dunk on John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, they heard me talking shit.
Discord knows.
Okay, we'll see what the recording looks. I mean, the recording's still going, so I guess that's fine. Anyways, the highlighter. All right. John Stuart Mill. The cause of profit is that labor produces more than it is required for its support. And he continues to say, the reason why capital yields a profit is because food, clothing, materials, tools last longer than the time which was required to produce them. So Marx is saying he confuses the duration of labor time, the duration of its products. So on this view, a baker whose products only last a day could never extract the same profit from his workers as a machine manufacturer whose products last for 20 years or more. Of course, it is very true that if a bird's nest did not last longer than the time it takes to build, the birds have to do without nests. So, pretty funny idea from Mill, like almost comical, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a silly theory, but
Also, I can absolutely eat a loaf of bread faster than the time it takes to make it.
I'm a baker, and yeah, I hate it.
yeah,
I mean, it's like the same thing about, like, it takes you an hour to cook dinner and like 15 minutes to eat it.
it also completely is, this like idea is completely subverted by planned obsolescence, right?
I was also going to say by reality.
By reality, and also like, but even like internal capitalist logic does not work this way, because their entire point is to make everything more and more disposable, last less and less time. But Mill is saying, well, actually, the longer something lasts, the more profitable it is. It's like, well, no, dude, because like if you make a car that it's just like it lasts forever, right? You can do like simple maintenance for 20, 30 years and it still runs just fine. Well, then I'm never going to go buy another freaking car. Because why would I?
So a lot of
right? But but if you make a car that's gonna like break down consistently and needs all these like weird, wacky parts that only the fucking manufacturer sells, eventually I'm just gonna like get a new freaking car because it's like too much of a headache, or it gets too expensive to fix. So I don't know. It's a silly theorem. I don't know why he thought that was correct.
Yeah. And on a personal agenda note, support right to repair.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, I mean, right to repair would pair extremely nicely with design that was intended to be repaired. So those go hand in hand.
And that's right. And the right to repair movement very largely is pushing for, not just, things like if you open the case of your phone, you're voiding the warranty and doing away with that, but also like, hey, maybe go back to where you can just pop the back off of your phone and replace the parts without, special tools.
Yeah. A little more dunking on just like basic definition stuff, I guess. He's like, oh, he's confusing what profits versus surplus value. Mostly Mark's just being picky. This is definitely like the shitpost section of this chapter. So need to spend a ton of time on
shitpost chapter.
This is my weekly exhortation to somebody to invent a time machine and show Mark's Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing he's dunking on is at the end here he's I mean, this is kind of interesting because I think this is actually almost like more resurgent propaganda from the olden days. But this, so he says, let's see, proving clearly that capitalist production would still continue to exist even if it did not exist, Mill proceeds quite consistently to show that it would not exist even if it did exist. He says, in the former case, where the worker is a wage labor to whom the capitalist advances the whole of his means of subsistence, the worker may be looked upon in the same light as a capitalist, since contributing his labor at less than the market price, he may be regarded as lending the difference to his employer and receiving it back with interest. So that's just laughable, right? So I mean, you're basically saying like, no, it's not surplus value. You're like loaning your surplus value or surplus labor to your boss so that they can use it as capital to grow their business. And then I guess the assumption is that receiving it back with interest, quote unquote, means you're going to get paid more. So if you, it's basically like if you voluntarily, it's basically like if you voluntarily, quote unquote, invest in your boss's business by working for less money, it's literally like trickle down. I mean, this is just trickle down, right?
Yeah. It's literally that thing that you hear, especially like in like toxic, quote unquote, family businesses where they're like, oh, we just, it's like we don't have like a lot of things to help us keep this afloat if anything goes wrong. So like we really, really appreciate you helping out and doing extra and going the extra mile so that we can keep this wonderful community institution open, and eventually as we become more successful, we want you to become more successful. But of course that generally doesn't translate to higher wages. It might just basically like there's like this veiled hint that, hey, if you don't help us stay in business by letting us steal your labor, you're not going to have any job. Or hey, maybe we can pay you more. It's like that constantly, like that carrot / stick sort of incentive structure that is toxic and terrible for a workplace But yeah, no, like that is absolutely what that is, and it is. Yeah, no, Mill absolutely deserved to be dunked on.
Yeah. And yeah, the whole point basically is that like Mill's saying like, oh, the workers are also basically capitalists. They're investing, except just not.
Going back to that grind set.
Yeah.
Oh, don't forget, you're a member of the corporate family.
That's right. And this was another
Tell me
good
now.
shit post, right? Or this would be like a tweet. On a level plain, simple mounds look like hills. And the insipid flatness of our present bourgeois is to be measured by the altitude of its great intellects.
I dare somebody to post that on Twitter right now.
You know, related to the whole Twitter thing, like we keep talking about how nice it would be if Marx had Twitter. He would have already been banned off it for fucking pissing off Elon Musk by now.
I mean, you solve that problem by blocking Elon Musk.
Okay, but do you really think Marx would leave such an easy target alone?
I mean, I talk shit about Elon Musk on Twitter all the time. I just have him blocked.
Fair.
Hombre, cálmese.
No, but come on, you can't tell me that Marx wouldn't want to actually be stirring shit with Elon.
Yeah. Marx is a drama queen.
All right.
He thrives on starting shit.
For chapter 17, I did brush this too. I tried to summarize it, a few quick slides, because it mostly is just a lot of words for some pretty straightforward math. This is again mostly review stuff. I don't think there's any like brand new revelations in this section really. So the first few assumptions he'll just give us a reminder of here. So the first one, commodities are sold to their value. So we're not assuming, we're basically saying like no one's getting swindled here. This isn't like a buy low, sell high type bullshit, right? We're not going to do that. And the other one is that the price of labor power occasionally is going to be above its value, but it's never going to be below its value. So basically, like, we're assuming that profit isn't being made or surplus value is not being generated due to the systematic underpaying of people, like paying them below subsistence wages, right? So now to be clear, that does still happen. Especially it's more common in places where you have, like, for example, very, very weak organized labor where they can get away with that. I mean, but even shit, you still have to see it in like servers in restaurants still get paid way less than subsistence wages because they're expected to collect tips, which is of course like not something that's totally guaranteed, and can vary quite a bit from day to day. How many tips you get. So systematic underpaying does still happen, but Marx is going to assume it's typically not happening. All right, and then we've got three primary variables we're going to look at real quick. So we've got the length of the working day. We've got our intensity of labor, which I've said is roughly how much work labor you do in a certain period of time. Right, so it's in physics we'd call that power. Right, it's just like how rapidly are you doing work. And then productivity of labor, again, I mostly just came up with a symbol rho, is roughly the number of commodities per unit labor. So it's basically just an efficiency calculator, right? It's how efficient is your labor producing commodities. All right, so he says first we'll assume that productivity is a variable and the working day and the intensity are going to be held constant. So there's three laws we can deduce from this. So if you give, first of all, within a given work day, the value generated is constant. So everyone's working at like basically the same intensity level, and they're working for the same amount of time. If that's the case, then the value generated is going to be the same in that time window. Next, we're going to say that there's, with this given, the second law he derives is there can be no rise in the value of labor power without a fall in surplus value. So they're basically inversely proportional. So yeah, this makes sense to us, right? Basically, so the value of labor power, if it goes up, so that could be for a number of reasons, but let's say, we'll say that like there's some class struggle going on. The workers go on strike. They're demanding better wages. For example, I don't know, something like that. That'll basically directly cut into surplus value, surplus profit. So that's again pretty straightforward. And then similarly, by the way, if you go the other direction, if you increase your productivity, so I guess the example I just gave would be an example of decreasing productivity through like work stoppage. So the workers are basically just like, F this, we're not going to work as much, or we're going to work like more lazily or something. I don't know. Yeah, that, or if they destroy machinery, something like cut into surplus value. On the other hand, if you go the other direction, now you have like some new technology come along, which let's be honest would be likely, that will increase the productivity of labor. And that, again, we learned in chapter 15 that comes back around and will actually decrease the value of labor power, because now the kind of bundle of commodities that the worker needs to reproduce themselves or just live suddenly became cheaper because we can make all those products more efficiently. So therefore, the cost of paying my workers is now dropping. Therefore, surplus value goes up. All right. And then the third law is basically an indication that this change is happening in one direction. So the changes in surplus value are caused by changes in the value of labor power and not the other way around. So that's what this symbol means. It's like caused by or because. So for example, surplus value will drop if and because the value of labor power goes up. For example, if you flip the arrows, still be a correct statement. Okay. Second part, we're going to assume labor intensity is now variable and the other two are constants. And by the way, when I say variable, I'm saying function of material conditions, because there's a lot of stuff that could affect these things. But we'll just lump it all under the umbrella of material conditions because that's what you do. All right, so Mark says this one's pretty straightforward. The value created within the working day varies directly with the the extent of the intensity to which the level of labor intensity varies from the social level of intensity. So just another way of saying value generated within a working day is proportional to the intensity of that labor. And that this increased value is only temporary until the social average intensity becomes normal for a given production process. And this is flip over this one too. So if I flip over to this graph, which I've referenced a bunch, I know I have here new technology, but just pretend like instead of new technology, let's say instead it says like increased intensity. We would be increasing intensity so that we are, well, it'd almost be the flip side of this graph. I remember that's not the best graph to look at then, but basically, the point is your increased intensity over the social average is usually going to be like temporary. Because if everyone else catches up and starts using the same practices, and they all push their workers just as hard, well, now the value of that commodity is going to just adjust to the social average. You're kind of back at square one. Third part, variable working day. Again, chapter 10, we already kind of talked about the working day a lot here, so we should be familiar with how this affects things. So, again, pretty simple. If you reduce the working day, you're just straight up reducing the surplus labor and surplus value that can be generated during that day. Pretty obvious. The inverse is also true, that if you lengthen the working day, you increase the surplus labor and surplus value generated. Pretty much S is directly proportional to the length of the work. So, again, that shouldn't be anything like too groundbreaking in here. You just sort of think through these equations. They're all like pretty self-explanatory, I think. So chapter 18. Oh, I guess he does go through a few of the scenarios where you could have like two variables changing at once, and what that looks like. Again, I don't think anything in there was sort of groundbreaking, but I will go through the conclusion paragraph here. I want actually, maybe the second to last is also a good one to look at real quick. So to kind of wrap this up, this is another nice summary. Not just this chapter, but a lot of different chapters. So the more the productivity of labor increases, the more the working day can be shortened. And the more the working day is shortened, the more intensity of the labor can increase. And we're looking at like two variables at once here. From the point of view of society, the productivity of labor also grows when economies are made in its use. This implies not only economizing on the means of production, but also avoiding all useless labor. Again, this idea between like productive and unproductive labor in a capitalist context. So you don't want anyone slacking off and like not working for capital. The capitalist mode of production, while it enforces economy in each individual business, also begets, in its anarchic system of competition, the most outrageous squandering of labor power and the social means of production, not to mention the creation of a vast number of functions at present indispensable and themselves superfluous. The intensity and productivity of labor being given the part of the social working day necessarily taken up with material production is shorter, and as a consequence, the time at society's disposal for the free intellectual and social activity of the individual is greater, in proportion as work is more and more evenly divided among all the able-bodied members of society. And a particular social stratum is more and more deprived of the ability to shift the burden of labor, which is a necessity imposed by nature, from its own shoulders to those of another social stratum. The absolute minimum limit to the shortening of the working day is, from this point of view, the universality of labor. But in capitalist society, free time is produced for one class by the conversion of the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time. So he's basically saying, like, you know, in a socialist world, wink, wink, hint, hint, the objective of our labor is basically to work as little as possible, right? Have all the free time we want. Free intellectual and social activity of the individual increasing. However, in capitalist society, only a very small group is actually receiving that benefit. So the free time is produced for one class by the conversion of the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time. So what the capitalists basically have like unlimited free time, right? Their entire lives are basically free because they do not need to work at all, because essentially the rest of us are working for them. And this hopefully isn't too controversial. Even capitalist shills like know this. I mean, this is like the whole point, isn't it? Right?
Although
Again,
I feel like they take this and they misinterpret it, this particular statement, to suggest that in socialism, yeah, nobody works and nothing gets done, and that's why socialism doesn't work. And I'm like, no, and you want to be like, no, you're almost willfully misinterpreting that, because you hear that argument a lot.
Oh yeah.
It's like,
You
yeah,
know.
it's like that's willful misinterpretation of what Marx is saying. Marx is saying it's not so much that not that nobody works under socialism. It's that we all work less because everybody works, and we're not just working for the sake of working anymore. We're not doing lots of useless labor that maybe we're still getting paid for, but but not really, just because we have to have a job, we have to have money to exist and to continue to live. That if everybody kind of pulls their weight, which is to include the capitalist class, who does not pull their weight currently, regardless of what they would like you to believe, then everyone would, in theory, have far more free time, because because nobody has to work, 80-hour weeks anymore. It's not necessary. At this point, I mean, it's not even necessary now, but in order to, I guess, maintain whatever lifestyle our capitalist overlords enjoy, though I wouldn't know anything about that, yeah, 80-hour weeks are entirely necessary.
yeah, and it's true. He even mentions like the superfluity of it all, like the Titanic means of production, but they're all, not all, but quite a bit of it is used for just the most insane, useless purposes.
Yeah.
That you're not bothering with making everyone's lives better. Yeah. Okay, so again, chapter 18, pretty much mostly review here.
Also, like, what, 4 pages long?
Yeah. Not too much going on. So, and I think, yeah. Rate of surplus value, we're coming back to this idea. S over V, which is our surplus value of a single labor, sorry, of average labor compared to the variable capital. Or, in other words, there's S over V, right? Another way of putting that would be surplus labor over necessary labor, because necessary labor is what defines the value of labor power, and we're paying everything at, remember our assumptions, right? We're paying for commodities, including labor power, at their value, so that is just what your variable capital is. It's money you use to pay wages, basically. So let's just reviewing that formula. The second formula he uses is the surplus value over the value of the product. I guess this one he's criticizing, maybe, or I guess, oh yeah, I think that's what he means. Like, this is what the political economists used to use, was more like this version, where it would be the surplus value or surplus labor over the entire working day. That's not really the same thing, although he kind of says they're kind of the same thing, actually, because working day is 12 hours. The only thing to do is just say 12 hours minus the surplus labor time is your necessary time. Because whatever is left over has to be necessary. So, really not that fundamentally different.
That little footnote there at the bottom is kind of chuckle-worthy. In the French translation of Capital, Marx placed parenthesis around this formula because the concept of surplus labor is not found clearly expressed in bourgeois political economy.
Wait. Is that the first
Uh,
page?
First
it's-
page of chapter 18.
Yeah. Right, yeah. Attached to the
Oh.
asterisk next to surplus labor.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, no, that gave me a good giggle.
I mean, it's kind of true.
No, I mean, giggle in the sense that it is absolutely true.
Yeah.
But also, for some reason, it was funny to me that he only did that in the French version.
Oh, that is interesting. So I don't really know why.
Yeah, no, I don't know why either. It was just funny without any additional context.
Yeah, so let's see. Anything else in here? I mean, I guess it's pretty obvious that you can't be working, you can't be providing surplus labor 100% of the day. So it always has to be less than 100%. So long as you are being paid a little bit, there's some necessary labor. And I actually want to say it's the next. Wait, is it the end of this? I think it is the next section, like chapter 19 or 20, where actually, let me see if I can. It's actually a pretty good section. I know this was like kind of sort of part of the reading, and I think formally, I think what I'll tweak the schedule to say is that next time we'll just do all of part 6, wages, and because it's pretty short on its own. I think it's like not that bad, but it's also all just the same topic instead of 2 different topics. Let's see.
Yeah, it's like, what, 25 pages maybe?
25 pages, yeah. So it's really not that bad for next time. We could throw in.
Yeah, 30 maybe. I can count.
We could throw in maybe 23 potentially. Although I don't know, 23 and 24 I think are a good pairing, honestly. Because 20, that will be about, let's see, 11 all the way to 58. That's like 40 some odd pages. That's also pretty reasonable.
Yeah, and we are kind of approaching, I'm going to say, that busy part of the spring for a lot of people, so shorter readings is probably going to work out well.
I agree, yeah. This one was pretty easy to get through. So yeah, I guess last thing I'll do, just because I wanted to bring back the old, literally the first presentation I made from Wage, Labor, and Capital by Karl Marx, or How I Learned to Stop Being Liberal and Love Political Economy. Couple things to keep in mind. I think he will go over them, but the distinction that Marx makes, and he makes a big deal out of, is Gonzo, you are very loud right now. Muting you for a second. Distinction between labor and labor power is a good thing to keep in mind here during this section. Just as a quick review of that, right? Labor is the actual act of working. So think of it as like the noun almost. And he says, this is another quote from it, right? So as soon as his labor begins, it ceases to belong to him and therefore can no longer be sold by him. And that the products of your labor are appropriated by the capitalist, versus something like labor power is your capacity or ability to do work. And that it is inseparable from the person who is doing it. And this is actually what gets sold to the capitalist in units of time, right? So that's what you're actually engaging in a labor market, is you are selling your labor power, capability to do work, to a capitalist in units of time, in chunks of time. So I will work, 9 to 5, 5 days a week for X number of dollars. And for that time, I am basically, as the worker, would be basically beholden to you and like pretty much have to do whatever you tell me to. Although usually that is also kind of part of the contract, is your basic job description, essentially. So, and then the wage, therefore, is basically just the price of that labor power. It's whatever happened to sell it for to the capitalist. So wage is just a fancy word for the specific type of price. Another, classic, like, again, this is a little bit more from the pamphlet version of this, because chapter 19, as I was telling Ithor, I already read it, and it's, I think some sections are literally like word for word the same as wage, labor, and capital. Since I believe he actually gave that lecture like while he was writing Capital, so I'm sure he just used that section essentially as like part of his speech, more or less. And yeah, so the idea of, why are people selling their labor? Well, have to, is in order to live, because otherwise you don't have any means of subsistence or existence, right? You gotta, if you don't own anything except your capacity to work, you're gonna have to sell that capacity to work in order to have something to eat and hopefully somewhere to live. Yeah, so your only source of income is sale of your labor power, right? And the idea here is that while you may not belong to this or that capitalist, right? Like, it's the idea of like, oh, we'll just get a better job, sweaty. Well, you're still working for a capitalist at the end of the day, so you are essentially owned by the capitalist class as a class. And so that's sort of the meme of like, well, that's wage slavery with extra. Wage slavery and slavery, not that much different. And in this chapter, well, let me see if I can just find this really quickly, because it's a really good, it's a really good comparison. Let's see. Is he okay? He's like comparing the like slavery, feudalism, and capitalism to one another. Gosh, let's see. Just really quickly, I want to scan through here because I didn't get my note system. Oh, okay, here we go. I think it's this chapter or this paragraph. So here we go. The wage form thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, aka into paid labor and unpaid. All the labor appears, keyword there, as paid labor. So think about that, right? When you go to work, you know you're getting paid to be there, right? $15 an hour, $20 an hour, whatever. $10 an hour, more realistically, maybe. So, it looks like, from the worker's perspective, if they haven't really thought it through, it looks like I'm getting paid for all of my labor, because that's what my contract implies, is that I get paid $10 an hour. So all of it seems to be paid. That's great, right? He says, well, if we rewind the clock, let's go back to the corvée system, which is, I guess, more of like a feudal arrangement. The labor of the serf for himself and his compulsory labor for the lord of the land are demarcated very clearly in space and time. So ironically, in feudalism, you actually have like a very clear distinction of like this amount of labor is for you, and this amount of labor is for the Lord, and it's very cut and dry. You absolutely are aware some of your labor is paid and some of it is unpaid. And then he goes, okay, let's rewind it a little more, right? Back in slave labor times, that the part of the working day in which the slave is only replacing the value of his own means of subsistence, in which he therefore actually works for himself alone, appears as labor for his master. All of his labor appears to be unpaid labor. In wage labor, on the contrary, even your surplus, aka unpaid labor, appears to be paid. So in the one case, the property relation conceals the slave's labor for himself, but in the other case, the money relation conceals the uncompensated labor of the wage labor. I mean, this paragraph is literally this meme incarnate, right? It's slavery with extra steps, or at least it's almost the same. It is almost the same as slavery, except it just looks different. Because in slavery, we think of slavery as like completely unpaid labor. Completely unpaid. You're not getting paid a dime for any of it. And while that's true in the sense that you'd never get money in your hand, at some point, the slave needs to be kept alive, ideally, so that they can continue working. So that some of their work is actually going towards their own subsistence, their own survival. And in capitalism, that's pretty much the same thing that's happening. You are getting paid enough to pay for your own means of subsistence so that you can actually come back to work the next day and continue working. And then all the rest of your time is unpaid labor. It's all surplus. Except it looks like you're getting paid for all of it. Because, hey, I have a wage, right? Oh, I'm not a slave. I work for money. Well, congrats, dude, because all that money just goes straight back to the capitalist when you have to buy all your shit to survive. I mean, it's not that much different. The irony is that you kind of this funny middle ground of like the feudal system where you're kind of almost very conscious of the fact that that part of your working day is unpaid. And I don't know if like, it's sort of funny to me that almost feels like a situation where you'd have the most class consciousness, ironically.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to be careful the way I phrase this because it's a spicy take and I realize it. But reading between the lines, you almost hear Marx in that alternating capital lowercase mocking voice. But capitalism is the best system that is the best system we've come up with. And he's like, okay, but like let's look at a couple of ways in which that is unequivocally not true. If only because capitalism is, at least under feudalism, at least, we sort of knew when we were getting screwed. Whereas
Right.
capitalism is set up as almost a sort of control system that
Yes.
tells you one thing that to keep you from being angry about your situation being absolutely no different than it was under feudalism. It's just obfuscated.
Right. And I'm sure we've all, most of us are probably familiar with the meme. Someone posted, if you have it ready, the meme of like the peasant who's like, oh, I'm sure the Lord like worked hard to get where they had or where they're at or something like that.
Yeah, no, like the serfs and the peasants absolutely knew that their feudal lords, that the people who owned the land didn't do shit.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
that's why it's
they
so
were-
funny, because it's like
yeah.
they're actually super aware that they're being fucked over, and that their part of their harvest is being taken by the Lord, who doesn't do anything, or at least anything they do is mostly just on paper. Like, oh, basically it's a protection racket, right? And then in slavery, it's like you're like the most hyper conscious of like the fact that you are literally a slave. You have like absolutely
Even
no free will, basically. So it's like you're
Yeah.
hyper conscious of like that fact that you're being like ruthlessly exploited. Capitalism is the best at concealing that relation because it makes you think that you're free.
and I feel like it makes you all the more angry once you figure it out.
Well, yeah, and not to mention because of everything we talked about in chapter 15, the fact that like you do have that there's this constant drive for productivity and automation, technology, industrialization, all that jazz makes it such that that if we had a better organization, we would all be working so much less. And that all this is completely unnecessary.
Yeah,
Makes it
yeah.
even more
I mean-
frustrating.
I mean, even going back to the technology argument about, technology ending up making people have to work more hours rather than less, whereas the whole point of technology ought to be the exact opposite. And that theoretically, under socialism, utilizing technology to its full extent, while also everybody putting in their fair share, should result in us essentially having to work a lot less while maintaining the same or better standard of living.
I would argue
I mean,
a much better standard of living for most people.
I mean, you
no, I'm
also.
But yes, I get.
Yeah, no, I'm just
you're
like
totally right.
taking the conservative, small c conservative.
To be fair, there would be
take on it.
a vanishingly small percentage of the population who would have a much worse quality of life and a much shorter life. Hint, hint, wink, wink.
Yeah.
It's also worth noting how there is a tendency to just create garbage non-jobs to validate the existence of some people at these sites. It's not a massive part of it, but they are there because it's kind of a let's find some way to make this person do something, which I find fascinating in a kind of what the hell sort of way.
Yeah, I actually at some point do want to like read. Is that the essay by Graeber, the Bullshit Jobs?
Bullshit Jobs, yeah.
I do want to look at that at some point because like I'm curious what his thinking on it is. Like, are those jobs just created out of whole cloth purely to keep consumerism going? I mean, that seems like what it would be.
Like, I feel like there are definitely two categories of what I would describe as sort of make work, where they're not jobs that exist in an organic sense due to demand, shall we say, but they're jobs that are created in order to prop up the idea that everybody needs a job. But there are definitely two types of that. And one type is what I'd call labor that is socially or culturally necessary, that maybe the quote unquote market forces don't demand. So things like a lot of what we saw in the Great Depression, where the government would hire people to go out and make art, to record history, to take photographs, do like kind of lots of documentary type work that typically only happens voluntarily, and they decided to actually pay people to do it, which is kind of why we have a lot of really good documentary evidence and records of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. But those are on their face still necessary to a degree. Whereas on the other hand, you have the other kind of make work, which is basically middle management.
Or the entire financial sector, frankly.
Yeah,
It really
I mean,
depends on
we've
where
definitely.
you start drawing the line with that. And
That's why I'm
apologies,
curious
Reddit.
what Graber would call a bullshit job. I just want to know. That's why I'd be curious in reading it at some point to kind of figure out what he thinks. Because I know we've had the discussion about the middle management before, right? Where, like Mark says in chapter 15 somewhere, you've got this army-like hierarchy of managers, basically, who are like trying to make sure that the laborers are staying on task and working at an appropriate intensity, all that jazz. But the irony is that hierarchy becomes so bloated that it becomes almost like a strain on productivity. And I'm sure, I know like Ithar has encountered this too, because I have as well. It's like when you get into a big institution, the admin and the bloat is so fucking frustrating to deal with.
It's one of those, you could literally replace everybody here with a cat whose job it is to shit in a box and everything would get done the exact same.
Yeah, because the people actually doing the work could not care less, typically, than what the admin says or thinks.
Yeah.
And then kind of to a middle degree, somebody doing work that is necessary at certain points in time, but regardless of circumstances, they're required to do it. And the thing that comes to mind to me is there was a really, really windy day a couple of years ago in the fall. So there's a bunch of leaves, all out on the sidewalk. And every couple of days, the city has people who go through and they blow off the sidewalks. So it's like 8 a.m, and I hear the leaf blower. And I'm like, all right, it's Thursday. But it's also like the wind's blowing like 20 miles an hour consistently. And so every single thing this guy blows off the sidewalk is going to get blown back on in the next 2 minutes. And
yeah.
So I said to my friend, so if you ever think that your job is useless, spare a thought for the guy with the leaf blower outside of my building this morning in 20 mile an hour winds.
Yeah.
In October. It's just, it's like, and I felt bad for the guy because he had to be out there. Like his contract basically said, hey, you got to go blow the sidewalk every Thursday, no matter what.
I mean, I think in that situation, especially if it's like essentially a what's it called, like a government position or some sort of publicly funded service. Yeah. I mean, to me that just sounds like Keynesian, right? Where it's sort of just, let's just inject some money into the local economy. Like, let's just give people some money to spend so that it eventually flows back into capitalist pockets.
But in an absolutely sane universe, that guy would get paid, but he wouldn't have to go stand out there doing work that is ultimately futile.
You're right.
That is futile, not futile. Sorry.
No, I understood. No, you're right. There's way better uses of people's capacities other than leaf blowing. Like, I don't know, affordable public housing or better road maintenance. I don't know. Pick something.
I mean, in a place where like you've got a lot of sidewalk traffic, blowing the leaves off of the sidewalk is kind of a safety thing, and I totally get that. But when it's windy and they're just going to get blown back on there in another 5 minutes, no, that is a waste of fucking time.
Yeah, that's pretty goofy. But God forbid we use public funding on anything that actually like has a long-term benefit for the community. Oh, the humanity.
Oh no, we might get something useful done. Whatever will we do?
Oh no,
we might give billionaires.
We might give people public spaces where they don't have to constantly be consumers.
And I salivate.
know, people might not have like a half a dozen teeth in their head rotting because they can't afford to go to a dentist.